I could still taste the sweetness of early satsumas as I tossed the peel onto the surface of the perfectly polished coffee table. A wine glass half empty from French Bordeaux stood on the table in front of me. For some reason, her words rang in my head for a few moments, seeking a safe place in the depths of my cerebral cortex to bring some clarity to what she was trying to tell me. I did not care. I've heard it all before. I just didn't pay attention until recently. Maynard, I'm going to go to the lake house for a few days, to get some rest and get my head in order, my wife of 14 years said as I sat on her terrible wicker couch. She had 3 suitcases near the door, the keys to her new car in her hand, and a wide-brimmed straw hat on her head. Would you kindly help me carry this to the car, Maynard? I looked at her like she had a huge damn booger on her forehead. Getting up from the couch, I grabbed my glass and silently walked out into the huge kitchen, poured the Bordeaux down the sink, and walked out the back door before sitting by the pool with a bottle of fresh Landshark lager in my hand. By the time I finished the first bottle, it was gone. I started to hate Bordeaux, which was a shame. This is one of the best French wines that ages beautifully, and for some reason my wife Cynthia started ordering it regularly when we were dining out and bottles of it started showing up in our house. I think my growing hatred of him was firmly ingrained when I found 2 glasses of wine on the chest of drawers in one of the guest rooms, along with a pair of gold cufflinks with my initials MB on them. I have never owned gold cufflinks and never worn them. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Maynard, please remember to feed Thomas and take him out for a walk before bed. You know what happens when he doesn't. I just passed out. Thomas is her damn dog, and he shits on the kitchen floor if you don't take him out to do his business every night. He is usually in the garden during the day, so this is not a problem. But that's not my problem anymore. Thomas is at the Humane Animal Treatment Center looking for a new person to make life miserable for. Cynthia just doesn't know about it yet. After the next 2 loggers, I started to think more clearly. Besides Bordeaux and that damn dog, another thing that really annoyed me recently was this huge monster house. Cynthia inherited it from her grandmother, and it remained in the family for over 175 years, with each generation adding more pieces to it beyond this one. It had 8 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms, not to mention 2 front living rooms, a front room, a dining room, a library, a huge kitchen, and more nooks and crannies than I could ever count. The house had a deep basement with granite trim, a wine cellar, and still had leaded glass windows dating from the mid-19th century, with a roof of slate and copper rather than tiles. If there was one thing that Cynthia valued as much as life, it was this house. I fucking hated him. So, at the age of 39, standing in the foyer of the house I hated, I finished my 4th Landshark and took a good look around. She should have arrived at the lake house about now, and if practice was any indication. The phone in my pocket vibrated. Maynard, the house, the lake house. Maynard, there was a fire, she said, almost hysterical. And there's a dead body in the ruins. Maynard, can you hear me? A dead body? Probably a tramp. Cynthia must be a tramp. I was never born for this. Hell, I shouldn't have been born at all if it weren't for a drunken military man who took advantage of a young girl. The first time, everything worked out just fine, and Marie Blanchard found herself with a baby in her belly and one of the best in the country, unwilling to take responsibility. Instead, he ended up in the hands of a very angry and determined Charles P. Maynard, who caught the boastful bastard outside a dusty bar in Port Allen, Louisiana, and offered him the prospect of death at the hands of a 58-year-old grandfather with steely blue eyes and an iron grip. From the stories I've heard over the years, this guy, my dear old dad, had lost the ability to ever please any young lady he liked. I don't know if it's true or not, but no one ever saw him again. Charles P. Maynard was a cantankerous old man who eventually died at the age of 87. He was also my great-grandfather and the only real father I ever knew. My mother's parents died in a car accident when she was young, and Charles took custody. I don't know the whole story, but it was decided to give me the name Maynard in his honor, Maynard Blanchard, 2 surnames. It was a difficult but relatively successful growing up in the Maynard household. Charles was a jack of all trades in logging, land rich, he said, with an empty wallet. He was exaggerating, of course. We never needed anything. Every year he took us on vacation to the Gulf Coast, and Christmas was always bountiful. Mom ended up marrying a pharmacist when I was 13, and I chose to stay with Charles in Baton Rouge rather than move to Mobile with her when I was given the choice. It was a good decision, looking back. She eventually ran away with a truck driver to Mexico before settling in Sacramento, California. I still get cards from her to see how she is doing, even though I've only seen her a couple of times since Charles died. Coming out of LSU a few years ago set me on the path I'm on now. I graduated with a degree in civil engineering and was hired by a New Orleans company that was looking for a road warrior, someone who could live out of a suitcase and work anytime, anywhere. The salary was good, the work was interesting, and I literally had no home. I lived exclusively in a hotel room, unless I returned home for the weekend, in which case I stayed with Charles. I spotted her across a hotel bar in downtown Jackson, Mississippi. I had been working on the road for a couple of years at this point, and was working on a project on a large construction site a couple of blocks away. She stood out with her cropped blonde hair and tight top that showed off her full breasts, and she wore bright red lipstick that seemed to be asking for a hug, or so the alcohol told me. I took another gulp of courage and slowly walked towards the end of it, stopping here and there. I didn't want to be obvious. She communicated with two other women, girls, one might say. We were all between 20 and 25. "Aren't you working at Lander's new facility?" she asked me right out of the blue, before I even had a chance to introduce myself. "Yes, ma'am, I'm the engineer on this project. My name is Maynard Blanchard. Nice to meet you." I shook her hand politely. "It's a pleasure, Maynard. I'm Cynthia Dawes, and these are my friends, Priscilla and Candace. Will you be working on this project until it's completed?" My friends looked at me carefully from head to toe, and Cynthia smiled sweetly. "As long as they keep me." I bought the next round of drinks and had a long chat with them, and that night I would have slept with any or all of them if given the opportunity. They knew this and just teased me terribly, real coquettes. I learned that Cynthia works in an office building across from the construction site, but she didn't say anything else. I assumed she had spotted me at the construction site from her office. After an hour of talking with them, three well-dressed men approached the group, each looking like they were about to take on the world. One of them, a guy named Michael Bishop, in his early 30s, was apparently Cynthia's current crush, and I could feel the testosterone inflating his ego. It didn't matter to me. He was a white-collar worker who clearly didn't work hard. If his self-confidence had deceived him, and he had tried to challenge me to a fight, I would have beaten the arrogance out of him, but that was not necessary. I just made a bad choice, so after I drank the last glass of ice, I headed to my room. The next evening, I was sitting with a beer in the same hotel bar, trying to catch some of the game on the overhead TV, when she slid into the seat next to me. This time she was wearing jeans and an old Miss t-shirt and sandals. The bright red lipstick gave way to a soft pink shade. "Missed you?" she asked. "I sat and missed you all evening in my beer." I chuckled. "Doesn't Mr. Bishop miss you?" "Oh, don't worry about him. He's busy." I didn't worry about him at all, and within 45 minutes we were upstairs with all four of her things lying on the floor of my room and her heels tapping on the ceiling. She was clearly talented, and after 3 times she jumped in the shower, got dressed, and returned home. A couple of nights later it happened again, and this went on for about a month, until Cynthia stayed the night. At breakfast the next day, she shared a couple of interesting facts. First, she worked for her father, who was the owner of the project I worked on. Second, she was going to announce her engagement to Michael Bishop at a dinner on Friday night. "So why are you here with me?" was my immediate question. "Because I like you and you're really good in bed." These are 2 very good reasons under other circumstances, but once the ring is on the finger, they become worthless excuses. I liked her too, and she was damn good in bed. She continued, "Maynard, it's more complicated than it seems. I was fascinated by you from the moment I saw you trying to sneak up to our table that night. I knew from the first sight that you were special, different from everyone else. But Mr. Bishop has a special sauce, right? I wasn't trying to be flirty or feel hurt by the turn of events. I was really interested. It's complicated. I'm sure so. Seriously, it is. Oh, damn, she replied with a slight pout. Bishop and Dawes is Dad's company now, since he bought most of Michael's dad's shares years ago. Michael is the senior vice president of the company, and we've known each other since I had breasts. I couldn't help but laugh at this. Well, he was my first at a tender age, and over the years it was always assumed that we would be husband and wife someday. Dad has always taken Michael under his wing since Mr. Bishop died a few years ago. Maynard, you probably won't understand. That's how it goes in our families. He and I have been engaged since time immemorial. This just formalizes it. So I was kind of like sowing oats for the bride-to-be. Don't get me wrong. I enjoyed every minute of it. I just felt like there was something more between us, that's all. It is. I just didn't expect things to get so complicated. I understood what she was trying to say. Rich people are different from us or them or anyone else. She was supposed to marry a guy she really liked, but she found something else that she liked better, but it didn't matter in the end. In a month, I will be leaving this property and Cynthia Dawes will soon become Mrs. Michael Bishop of Bishop and Dawes. Company I would be in another city with another woman, and with my eyes set on the next destination, or so I told myself. To the bride-to-be, I said, raising my glass of juice. On the Thursday night before her engagement, we made love until 3 in the morning, and her two friends, Priscilla and Candace, escorted her out of the hotel room, both looking back at the naked and very pleased subject of the bachelorette party. I just blew a kiss and smiled. The project finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and after a long weekend at Charles's, I began work on a hotel project in Memphis. It was somewhat melancholic after the whirlwind of the previous weeks with Cynthia. I mostly kept to myself, having lunch and the occasional beer at the bar. Finally, some young professionals working on the project dragged me out to Beale Street one evening, where they got me drunk and I embarrassed myself. The result was that I spent the night with a rather attractive middle-aged woman who the next morning did not know my name, but this did not stop her from continuing her morning pleasures. She was a recent divorcee named Bella who had just discovered that there were men in the world who didn't view her as outdated property, someone to use when the husband's mistress is busy. Her ex-husband left her a year ago for a young model, left her a good allowance, and now she is discovering a new life for herself, using me as a current measure. I liked her, not just because of the good sex. I liked her tenacity, or whatever the spirit is called in women who, after years of supporting their insignificant companion, discover their own attractiveness despite the humiliation of their ex-husband. Bella had 2 teenage daughters who were currently visiting their father and his new wife, so her weekend was free, and over breakfast, we decided to spend it together exploring the city, the river, and the surrounding area. "Maynard, what are you going to be when you grow up?" she asked, looking up from behind her morning latte with a sly smile. I thought about becoming a gentleman farmer, but even my weeds don't grow with regularity. There was a lot of truth in this. Charles was trying to interest me in working on a large piece of land he had on the Port Hudson Plains just upstream from Baton Rouge before getting to the Bluffs. He had 300 acres of good land, which he bought at auction and leased to a cattleman. I just couldn't get interested in it at the time. I was going to LSU, and football and girls were much more exciting. My first boyfriend was a farmer from Greenville, Mississippi, where I grew up. His father grew soybeans and everything else that made money. We were very serious until I left for school after graduation, and then I was attacked by a shark. A shark? Yes, my ex-husband. He was finishing law school, and I had just arrived on campus, being a pure and innocent girl from a small town who had never known a real man. Damn, it's not fair. My first boyfriend is now a great man, happy, successful, married. He has 4 children. He has his own business. But then he was just a boy when we first met, and remained the same boy when I left. So the shark ruined you for the other boys? Well, I guess so. He pulled me out of the market before I was 18, married me 2 years later, and had twins a couple of years after that. For some reason, I thought about Marie Blanchard and how much better her life would have been if she had had the same circumstances, even if her nasty husband had run off with some young bitch. Bella and I had a lovely day on the river and took an evening boat ride with dinner before returning to my room for the night. By morning, I had a renewed admiration for middle-aged women and mothers. She was tireless, and by any standards, her ex-husband was a damn idiot. Sunday was repeated, and by Monday morning, she was back in her normal life as a mother and a struggling career woman, the few years difference in our ages probably being a barrier to anything more than erotic stimulation. She still left me her business card. Over the next 4 months, I finished my job in Memphis and returned to Baton Rouge on vacation before taking on planning work in the New Orleans office. This kept me from traveling for the next 6 months, and by then my feet were itching for other pastures. We didn't have to wait long. Maynard, you're coming back to Jackson for that same Lander client. Sam, my boss, told me over lunch one day at Ryan's pub on Bienville Street. Why, what happened at the facility? I asked curiously. Bank, I don't know if there's anything specific there or not. All I know is that the client wants to revise some plans and wants the same guy who worked on the first project. Consider that a good recommendation, he laughed. 2 weeks later, I found myself in Jackson, staying at the Marriott Center, sitting with a beer in the same hotel bar where I had parked at the first project. A meeting was scheduled for the morning with a client, none other than Bishop and Dawes. Ever since I arrived in town, I couldn't get the memory of Cynthia Dawes out of my head, and as I walked through the brass doors of the B&D building, I half expected her to be there, greeting me. This did not happen. Instead, a guy who looked like Poindexter greeted me as he stepped out of the elevator to take me to the 6th floor, projects department. He led me through a series of cubicles and windowed offices before we entered a large conference room half filled with people. Mr. Blanchard, glad you could join us. Welcome to Bishop and Dawes. I'm Cecil Dawes, and we'll meet everyone in a moment, he said. I estimated his age to be around the late 50s, maybe early 60s, and he had no special pretensions, which was unexpected for me for such a wealthy man. Everyone grabbed coffee and Danish pastries to meet, and when we were seated, Mr. Dawes began the introductions. If he didn't recognize me from the first meeting, Michael Bishop hit it well. The project was truly worth the trip. B&D wanted to build a large atrium on the other side of the lender's state building and connect it either through an overhead bridge or through a wide underground gallery with shops and cafes. Their architects drew sketches of both proposals, and we discussed the specifics of the project all day. When the business meetings ended, Mr. Dawes excused himself, saying that he had a pre-planned event and several of us had dinner planned for that evening. Michael Bishop apologized for personal reasons. As we shook hands, I couldn't stop thinking about how good it felt making love to his wife. Impressive. I like his plans for the atrium, I managed to say. Nancy seemed to be aware of what Cynthia was up to, because she had that subtle, devious Mona Lisa smile on her face. Here's the thing, I've always avoided sleeping with married women. It was something Charles taught me. When you sleep with a married woman, Maynard, that's what happens. First, you're messing with something that doesn't belong to you. You might as well break into a man's house and piss on his rug. Second, you have no respect for yourself for having a woman who would do this to her husband. Third, you better get out of town as quickly as possible because this has caused the death of more people than the police. Find yourself a woman who is not attached to some other guy, and your love life will be much more enjoyable. There are millions of them out there, believe me. And I did small errands for the woman next door whose husband was a truck driver. Charles knew her reputation as a youth hunter and her penchant for much younger lovers. This was good advice. Her husband found her in bed with a guy from Pryorville and shot them both. He didn't kill them, but he spent 6 years in Dixon prison, and she still walks with a limp. That evening it became increasingly difficult to follow Charles's advice, but Cynthia made it easier. After a couple of drinks and conversation, she and Nancy said they were leaving me with a kiss and a hug. I was left sitting at the bar, debating whether to finish my beer or go upstairs to manually satisfy my frustration. I found a compromise and did both. The rest of the week passed in a whirlwind of meetings with the main participants in the project, and by the end of the week, everyone agreed on the air bridge option. I called my office and told them I was staying an extra week to evaluate our contributions. I hadn't seen Cynthia since the evening of our dinner, and on Friday night, I was looking around at the crowd of merry people at the bar. The retro disco band settled in for the night, and rhythmic covers of KC and the Sunshine Band thundered across the glowing checkered dance floor. Her hand slid to my shoulder and gently stroked the tense muscles as I turned and saw her blue eyes. "I'm surprised some cutie from Mississippi hasn't caught your ass from Louisiana yet." I kept her glued to the seat. "Let's change this." Cynthia took me to the dance floor and gave me a demonstration lesson on how to be impeccably dressed, move my ass to the beat of the music, and do it all in heels, all while keeping my eyes locked. The next song was slow, and I noticed the ring on her finger. It wasn't a big shiny rock. In truth, it didn't look like an engagement ring at all. It was a simple small ring with an opal in the center. "Don't you think Mr. Bishop might be a little upset to see his woman in the arms of another man tonight? He's at a party in Houston with some of his old Miss classmates. He'll be back in time for your meeting with the team on Monday morning." "Well, that's not exactly what I had in mind," I answered questioningly. The song ended, and I suggested we take our drinks and find a table. What I meant was that I'm sure he wouldn't appreciate me having fun with his woman this evening. It makes dinner more awkward, doesn't it? "Oh, I'm sure he'll be a little annoyed to see me sweating with a hottie like you, but I know for a fact that he doesn't need to know that." The waitress approached us to take our orders for more drinks, and Cynthia took a moment to cross her legs, allowing the deep slit of her dress to enticingly reveal her long, toned thigh. She knew what she was doing because I had to adjust my pants to avoid an awkward moment. "So why didn't you go to the party with him?" I asked with sincere curiosity, in order to distract myself from her charms. "I don't know these people, and frankly, I hate events like this, especially in Houston. Besides, I'd rather be here with you." At that moment, she stood up with a joyful expression on her face and began waving her arms and shouting, "Here, here." 3 friends stood at the bar, each dressed for a killer party in heels and similar styled dresses. Priscilla, Candace, and Nancy, whom I had already met, came over and pushed another one towards our table. "I see you found your handsome boyfriend." Candace grinned. "Will you share?" All 4 of us thought it was bloody funny, and surrounded by beauty, all I could do was smile with them and thank my lucky stars. The truth is that if it weren't for the ring on Cynthia's finger, I would have preferred to keep the table just between us. As it was, I could only enjoy the sense of each woman, not an easy job, as some might think. The rest of the evening was spent quickly learning how all 4 women moved on the dance floor, fast and slow. Candace wasn't kidding about sharing and made her intentions clear, especially during the slower songs. Unfortunately for her, and perhaps for me, Cynthia interrupted her. "There are plenty of other guys in the room for her to have fun with," she whispered in my ear while dancing. "Maybe, but she seems to be interested in Creole cuisine, and I know my way around sauces." "I know that too well, don't I?" That's how our conversation went, and by the time we got back to the table, Candace and Nancy had already snatched up a couple of very lucky young people, and I sat there counting my losses. "Don't look so gloomy, Mr. Blanchard. The evening is still young." A big smile shone on Cynthia's face. "Priscilla, let's dance." With these words, I left Mrs. Cynthia Dawes Bishop sitting at the table, and Priscilla walked me through her steps. "Do you know that she is determined to repeat that great night you spent together before her engagement dinner?" "Well, perhaps, but my long-held moral principles tell me that Michael Bishop has nothing to worry about on my part." She just chuckled quietly to herself and looked around the room. "Oh, I don't see Mr. Bishop anywhere around," and she burst into a cheerful laugh as we returned to the table. By then, the others were already there, and Cynthia ordered a round of drinks for the table. "For a wonderful evening, ladies, Mr. Blanchard and I have more important matters to attend to." For that, all three young women responded in unison as I sat a little puzzled. All three stood up and mingled with the crowd again. "Now, Maynard, let's check that the maids have fluffed your pillows well." She was turning into a seductress before my eyes, and Charles's reminder was beginning to ring in my ears. "Don't sleep with married people. Don't sleep with married people. Don't sleep." "Cynthia, I think you haven't forgotten how I feel about pursuing someone else's wife. It's just not my style." She looked at the ring on her finger, and her face instantly lit up. "Oh, that? Oh, I can handle that." She took the ring off her finger and put it in her purse. "There, now I'm not married anymore, and now you can pursue your woman, Maynard." She purred. Charles had never covered such a scenario, so I was a little confused. "Seriously, Maynard, me and Michael were never married. Take me upstairs, and I'll tell you everything in the morning." My expression probably said it all, because Cynthia stood up from the table and took my hand, leading me to the elevators. Of course, I just followed this delicious treat like a fly caught in Charlotte's web. She reeled me in for eating. I missed it incredibly once I found it again. I just didn't know how much it affected me. Looking back, I have to admit that I was hopelessly under the thumb. It was so good that there was almost nothing I wouldn't do for her. The next morning, over Danish pastries and coffee, she told me her story. "You know, we had an engagement party and Michael put a huge diamond on my finger. Everything was fine, but there was one problem, and it clearly made itself known. After Dad published the ads in the newspaper, she must have realized that she is being bypassed." "Who is she?" I inserted it. "Why, of course, his single mother. And not just any single mother. Michael fathered a child with Miss Monique Pressler, whose family funds almost every major project in Mississippi, including several of my dad's businesses, such as Lender's State." Dad took him aside and asked him if what the Presslers were saying was true, and he admitted it. "We're a little old-fashioned here, Maynard. In some families, including ours and the Pressers, if you make a child one of the precious daughters, you get yourself a wife." She actually laughed. "So the wedding was called off, and it was kept secret for a while until Michael and Monique had their big wedding. I think I was mad at first, but I quickly moved on. I decided I was saving myself for you." Even I thought it was funny. "So now," I asked her, "you will be my husband, and we will live happily here in Jackson." She was so confident in herself that I even began to believe it. "Why does your father still keep Bishop around?" "Family obligations plus," I asked him. "I still like Michael. He screwed up, but he named his child and didn't run away. He just won't be my husband. You will." "You poor young henpecked man." Charles barked when I told him about the events of my return to Jackson. "You'd be better off with that hot mom you were with in Memphis than marrying some spoiled rich girl. I bet she'll make you sign a prenup. If so, make her sign yours. Damn, you'll be rolling in the mud when I lay back." He laughed loudly and poured himself another cognac. Charles has always been like this. He really enjoyed my adventures with Bella, but he took prenuptial agreements seriously. I was his only heir, and one day I would have more land than I could do anything with. He had one last piece of advice about Cynthia that I would like to pay more attention to. "Son, if you marry this girl, keep your eyes open and your sense of smell sharp. These rich people have completely different moral standards. They can't help it. That's how they were raised. And you, well, you're almost a coon ass, or at least, he would have been if it were for your mother, God rest her wherever she is." "In California, Charles," I interrupted. "Oh yeah, well, we have our ways of dealing with rich guys who start chasing other people's women. Some guy in an expensive suit will start chasing your woman. Just remember that. There are plenty of alligators with an appetite for blue blood in these swamps." Yes, he was of the old school. I remember thinking then. As I said, I was hopelessly under the thumb, and that remains my excuse. Cynthia and I got married after a long conversation with Father Dawes. I tried not to laugh when I thought about that nickname, but he was serious. There were rules of decency for joining the family, and this was my great privilege. Overall, Cecil Dawes was a good and fair man. I agreed to keep his daughter in Jackson when my company allowed me to work from the local Jackson office instead of traveling to New Orleans. I still had to travel a lot, although Cecil did everything he could to persuade me to come work for him, although I refused every time. Eventually, the company promoted me to regional manager, and I no longer went on business trips. The first few years of marriage were, as many would say, blissful. We jumped on each other regularly and often. Of course, I had to live with the expectations of dinners and big events held at the Dawes estate, with all their pretentious manners, but I really liked Father Dawes. I could talk to him like a man and not like some kind of sycophant, and he was not offended. About a year before our 4th anniversary, a series of events occurred that disrupted all expectations and plans for the future. The first event was the sudden death of Cecil Dawes one afternoon at a charity golf tournament. He fell dead from a heart attack, collapsed like an empty sack. His wife, Emily, didn't slow down for a moment. Their relationship is worth noting. Cynthia's mother died when she was a little girl, and Cecil married Emily when Cynthia was 14. There was never love between the two women, but Cecil was wise enough to provide Cynthia with everything she needed, giving his second wife enough influence and prestige to keep her content and tamed. When Cecil died, my wife inherited 45% of his estate, Emily went to 35%, and to my surprise, he left me 20%. These were also voting shares in B and D. Emily also received a seat on the board of directors of Bishop and Dawes, and in cooperation with the majority of the board, appointed Michael Bishop to the position of head of the company. With the proceeds of her inheritance, Cynthia retired at the age of 27 and became involved in charitable work. Emily, on the other hand, married Michael Bishop's father-in-law, the respected Fox Pressler. As a result, the boards of directors of both family companies cross-pollinated. Cynthia simply lost interest unless there was a board meeting or investor conference she had to attend. The second important event was the death of Cynthia's maternal grandmother. Mabel Nason was the owner of old money, dating back to the Civil War, when some great-grandfather of hers or someone else had the foresight to turn most of his holdings, except his antebellum home, into bullion, which was safely hidden from the greedy hands of the Union. Mabel left her vast estate to Cynthia, and the couple Maynard Blanchard and Cynthia Dawes Blanchard moved into the house, occupying about a third of the rooms of the luxurious mansion along the Natchez Highway. The latest event was that my mentor and only relative on this side of the Mississippi, Charles P. Maynard, died of weariness of life at the age of 87 years. He left me everything he owned, including his house in Baton Rouge. He told me once that he would leave something for my mother if he could figure out exactly where the hell she was. His words. Mother returned to Baton Rouge for the funeral, and I must say she looked pretty good for a 45-year-old woman on her third marriage. She was tanned and well-groomed in a Californian way, and everything was in place. The man with her was about 60 years old, looking like a fortune hunter, who probably kept her around for sex and her wallet. Marie Blanchard Parker Simpson struck gold in Sacramento with Arthur Simpson Roman III, who left her one hell of a fortune when he died of a sexually induced heart attack 3 years ago. It was something Charles always laughed about, and here she was, presiding over his modest funeral. He allowed only his mother, me, Cynthia, his lawyer, and a little widow to be present, whom he supported even in her old age. Once he was buried under a few buckets of his own soil. Well, technically it was already my land. We all gathered in the living room of Charles's large house, and the lawyer read out his will. As mentioned, I was the sole heir, but there was a letter addressed to me asking me to make some donations on my own. We didn't go into detail, but I thought it appropriate to provide a small stipend to a comfortable widow. Mother was not interested in anything, so we completed all the tasks and returned to our business. When the dust settled, I became what Charles always called the rich land with the empty purse. I had land holdings in Louisiana, Mississippi, and East Texas, mostly forested land, but also quite a bit of leased agricultural land. Along with the house in downtown Baton Rouge, there was a modest bank account and 2 commercial buildings in downtown Baton Rouge. My instructions to the lawyer were to keep it all in a portfolio, and I would periodically manage the investments. According to my review, rental income will continue to be deposited in the bank account. I really didn't have time for this. My work kept me busy, and given Cynthia's schedule, I left most of the questions to the lawyer. All the members of Cynthia's Pussy Parade, as I called them, were happily married and lived leisurely lives somewhere in the crossroads of the South, as Jackson is sometimes called. Priscilla and Candace married wealthy lawyers, each at least a dozen years older than their fiancés. Nancy met a former Ole Miss football hero who was then a state senator and wanted to run for Congress when he could raise enough bribes to make it happen. In their free time, they preferred to retire to the Nason house on Natchez Trace, where Queen Cynthia was staying. I guess I didn't really mind that much. They were all easy on the eyes, and given the near-total lack of clothing by the pool, I enjoyed many days just sipping beer while blindfolded. Married life continued for both of us, and nothing was out of place or askew for the next few years until what I came to call the conversation happened. "Nancy, have you decided who you'll hire to replace Beau?" Priscilla asked one afternoon by the pool. I was working in the pump room, trying to fix one of the salt filters and just minding my own business. "Girl, I tried a couple of them last week and Ben was a damn loser. He was able to get up only once and then only to get pleasure. But Santos, this boy, he is a completely different matter." "Damn, that looks like fucking Michael, huh, Miss Blanchard?" Candace said to my wife too loudly. "Lord, woman, be quiet. He's right in the house." She responded by nodding towards the house and turning to me, bursting into quiet laughter. "These are things that husbands don't need to know about, you know." "God bless him," Priscilla added. "Although, girl, I don't know why you need Michael with your own top-notch supplies to run this business. We don't know a single respectable woman who doesn't keep a man on her side, unless she's some poor idiot who can't afford it." Nancy intervened. "Cynthia, Michael has had you since you were married, even longer. Why didn't you change racehorses?" asked one of them. Michael sized her for her first training bra. Candace echoed the others' bursts of laughter. Cynthia giggled along with the others and then added, "If Michael hadn't slept with me, there wouldn't have been anyone else. The way it is, so Nancy, is Santos the one?" At this point, the conversation grew, and I retreated back into the house through the service entrance. We had been married for over 12 years by then, and given how I felt at that moment, 12 minutes longer would have been too much. I poured myself a cold beer, retreated to my personal space in the wine cellar, and decided that the conversation needed a plan. "God, Maynard, this just feels so damn good." The young lady was in her late 30s, but she looked several years younger. The girl was a bar administrator in downtown Baton Rouge, worked in a law firm, and spent her free evenings learning the intricacies of the game of 9 and being quite good with a cue. She beat me up for 3 episodes, and I ended up buying her drinks until the young lady agreed to have sex with me in the big master bedroom of the house Charles left me years ago. She soon became my constant friend when I was in Baton Rouge. Part of the plan was to get back on the road, or at least appear so. Instead of spending my frequent flyer miles, I decided to stop by the old house often and keep an eye on the briefcase the old man had left in my care. I spent half my time in Baton Rouge, a third of my time on my property, and the rest of my time in the delicious lair of my beautiful and adulterous bitch wife. Cynthia's father owned a lake house on a reservoir at the head of the Pearl River, which she bought from Emily Pressler. It became her personal escape and refuge. I didn't like the place because it was nothing more than a house on a large, secluded lot in the lake area. It seems she spent a lot of time at the lake, accompanied by one lover. My idea of escape was to go down to the Atchafalaya River Basin, where Charles always kept a large houseboat moored that can only be reached by boat. And if you are not an experienced raccoon, you will need a GPS locator to get there. This is where the key elements of the plan came together. Sure, you can do all this, and then some if you want, the big-eared cauliflower man told me as he sipped a warm, tasteless beer. Rudy Cormier leaned back in his chair on the veranda, looking out over the tethered end of the houseboat we called camp, pushing away the occasional wisp of smoke that might emanate from the thick cigar at the corner of his mouth. He was the child of his family, the youngest son of Manfred Cormier, vile but half trustworthy if you were related or close, and an old friend of Charles when he was alive, especially in his youth. You have to push the whole thing away from the shore and move it around a little bit so it doesn't float back to the surface and everything, you know what I mean? Rudy continued. I'll tell you what, if you get him there, they'll never see him again, but it'll cost you. Rudy knew I was willing to pay for what needed to be done, and he and his team were the ones who did it right without having a clue. We agreed on the details and then went back to having fun inside the boat. You big bastard raccoon, fuck that thing real good. You're damn right you're a hot little bitch. God, you're hot, Ruddy exclaimed. It was all over pretty quickly, and after we got ourselves cleaned up, we took the boat towards Belle River to get back to Baton Rouge. When I returned to Jackson, Cynthia was at the lake, or at least that's what the GPS app on her phone said. I could confirm this, but at that moment I did not need it. I could watch any number of digital videos throughout the house on Trace, or turn on a video feed from the lake. In any case, after some time, when the anger passed, I became bored with it all. She was brainless when it came to technology, or she was so careless in her affairs that she didn't care, who knows. I must have been brainless myself for it to go on for so long, and for me to remain ignorant. Shortly after the talk, I outfitted both places with cameras, and a week later I had a video feed from one of the guest rooms, where I watched two longtime lovers enjoying a bottle of Bordeaux and having sex to death until the early hours of the morning. Looking back, I wish I had installed two-way audio in the room, so I could applaud their performance for their benefit, but that would have been premature. It was this first recorded performance that convinced me to start enjoying the pleasures of the fair sex. In any case, I needed to carry out my plan. Cynthia, why don't you sell your stake in the company and put the money into better investments? The dividend stream cannot compete with what the market is offering right now, I asked her over dinner one night. She didn't think much about it because she had become lazy and complacent like a spoiled rich girl, even at the age of 37. I worked on it until she agreed to talk to a broker to see what her options were. I had one broker in mind. Rudy Cormier, for all his back-alley attributes, knew how to put on a suit and look the part. He did this for years. He could be huge, but he dressed well, and the ladies usually liked it. Cynthia ate it all and agreed to go to dinner with him. Hey man, after all this happens, can I get this baby into bed? He whispered to me as we left. I'll trade her for those two Cajuns down south if you'll just take her there and leave her there. I was joking, but only half joking. Rudy convinced Cynthia to sell her shares in Bishop and Dawes if she could get a high valuation for the goodwill. After taxes and fees, she will receive almost $15 million and will earn significantly more than the 2% dividend she was currently receiving on those shares. When it was all done, Cynthia had invested her money in half a dozen legitimate accounts, and now B&D had a minority owner in an investment bank in New Orleans, backed by at least a dozen owners, leading nowhere. I later listened to her relay this information to Michael Bishop, just after he had finished having sex with my dear wife. What did you do? He roared. I transferred my inherited shares into several investment accounts and received good appreciation for them. That at least doubles my annual income, she replied. Damn it, Cynthia, my job is on the line. I have a family trust, but the new property puts my job at risk. I thought he was going to cry, but he didn't. Show me what you did so I can be sure everything is okay. They both jumped out of bed and ran to the office on the second floor, where Cynthia showed Michael your online accounts and transfer results. He realized that she got a great price, better than anyone else was offering. If she hadn't been so easy to get, I might have felt better about getting her such a good deal. I had already crossed the line where I didn't care about Cynthia's loyalty. I still slept with her, of course, but I became callous and a little bitter. Charles' admonition haunted me several times. I should have been doing business, but instead I allowed myself to become a whip for her whims. Watching her sleep with her longtime lover, who was supposed to be me, made me want to make things right, and that meant I needed to focus my attention on Michael Bishop. All I needed was an alligator with a taste for cowardly scum. He was CEO of B&D for more than 9 years and became comfortable in the position, achieving only moderate success. However, with the support of his father-in-law's wife and stepmother Cynthia, Emily Pressler, Michael Bishop decided that arrogance and privilege suited him better than others. Add to this that he had my wife, one of his key benefactors, and the stench of this paraworld became unbearable for me. However, I had to bide my time. I continued to transfer my power of attorney to Emily Pressler, and with her Bishop continued his role in the large corner office. A certain investment firm on Canal Street in New Orleans was in no hurry to make changes at that time. I made him feel comfortable and gave him the whole house to tie the rope around his neck. Cynthia was becoming careless. They would leave an empty bottle of their precious French Bordeaux in the guest room, thinking the maid would clean it up. He even forgot a pair of gold monogrammed cufflinks, leaving them on the bedside table. As I saw, feeding time was approaching. The trigger was pulled when I met with Emily Pressler and informed her that I was transferring my proxy votes to Manicure and Sizemore, a private equity firm based in New Orleans. They were going to take action at the next quarterly board meeting. I already knew that Emily would immediately inform Michael Bishop about the impending disaster, and the first person with whom he would share his dissatisfaction would be my wife. Those bastards, your husband gave his proxy votes to the bastards you sold your shares to. Do you understand what this means? You. Cynthia just looked at him with a slight grin. You have a family trust, Michael. What is the problem? He looked at her with amazement on his face. Cynthia, my salary is 3 times what I get from the trust. He threw his glass into the fireplace out of anger. This is all good and wonderful for you. You're sitting on millions and living large. She tried to calm him down by sitting on his lap and then added fuel to his anger. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of you. She may have been serious, but for a little pipsqueak who considers himself an alpha male, being perceived as a keep is a bit humiliating. He removed it from his lap and stood up, pacing the room before grabbing his jacket and leaving the house. I, of course, watched the events via remote broadcast, and after they were over, I went upstairs to my bed in Baton Rouge and had sex with my little Wendy almost to the point of unconsciousness, all the time with a big smile on my face. Maynard, you need to go back to Jackson and play by the rules, Rudy Cormier said with a small grin and a golden sparkle in the top corner of his mouth. It's time to play ball. With that, the wheels started turning and I headed back towards the Natchez Trace. Cynthia was out of the house with the pussy parade and the house was silent except for the little dog who looked at me as if I was trespassing on his territory. One of the amigos gave this purebred little Yorkie to her for her birthday and he never learned to stop shitting on the kitchen floor. An hour later, he was locked up at our local animal shelter and I returned home. Call me an evil, insensitive bastard. I don't care. I didn't hear her come in that evening, and when I woke up the next morning, she still hadn't moved. By the time I returned around noon, she was getting ready to go out again. Maynard, I'm going to go to the lake for a few days, to clear my mind a little bit and clear my head, my wife of 14 years said as I sat on the terrible wicker couch. One thing I never quite got over was Cynthia's taste for over-the-top decor, but it was her house, and it didn't matter much to me as long as I had my safe zones to retreat to when needed. At the moment, it didn't matter at all. She left a few minutes later, and I remained by the pool, quickly downing 6 bottles of Land Shark lagers. I know it's a weak beer, but I still like it. I needed a beer to take her last call. Maynard, the house on the lake. Maynard, there was a fire, she said almost hysterically. And there's a dead body in the ruins. Maynard, can you hear me? Dead body. Probably a tramp, Cynthia, just a tramp, was my half-drunk answer. When Cynthia arrived at the lake house, she found it already completely burned. It was a smoking mass of ash and charred timber, with police and firemen everywhere. Firefighters searching the wreckage found a partially burned body in what had once been a bedroom. It was naked and apparently asleep, but it was impossible to determine. The only distinguishing feature was the remains of a dental bridge. He was somewhat protected as he lay face down and collapsed on the floor of the ruins. In her hysterical state, the police were unable to obtain any reasonable information from Cynthia, so they postponed the questioning until a later time. By the time they succeeded, investigators quickly determined it was arson. Whoever started the fire was inept and used too much fuel. 2 investigators showed up at the house around 5 o'clock that evening, wanting to question me regarding my knowledge or understanding of what had happened. Fortunately, my lawyer arrived early to discuss various investment issues, including my current ownership of Bishop and Dawes. Of course, this was a coincidence. Mr. Blanchard, can you confirm your location from the time you left home in the morning until your return around noon? My lawyer intervened. Is Mr. Blanchard suspected of any wrongdoing? He is considered a material witness at this time until we determine otherwise. I hope you understand, lawyer, one of them answered. My lawyer simply nodded at me. I had breakfast and a business meeting at Emily Pressler's home with her husband Fox Pressler until he left for another meeting. I arrived at 9 a.m. and left shortly before 11:30 a.m. Of course, they can both attest to that, and I'm sure my GPS data will also confirm this. Have you met Michael Bishop? Of course I do. He's the CEO of a company I have a stake in, my late father-in-law's company. He's an old childhood friend of my wife. He's Fox Pressler's son-in-law. They muttered something among themselves, asked a few more clarifying questions, and, after a few pleasantries, left. Cynthia arrived just after they left. Maynard, the police, they think the body in the fire is Michael, or Michael. I looked at her with almost contempt on my face. Who's Michael? Michael Bishop. You know who I'm talking about. Of course I do. And he smiled. She looked at me strangely and went upstairs. I didn't follow her and walked my lawyer to the car before walking around to the pool and taking a seat on the patio. Over the next few days, circumstances and evidence led investigators and others to the Natchez Trace. The forensic laboratory and coroner determined that the body found in the wreckage at the lake was not that of Michael Bishop, but that of an unknown John Doe with Michael's carelessly inserted dental bridge in his mouth, along with his wallet. It was a poor attempt to pretend that Bishop had died in a fire, and adding to the mystery, he had not been seen since he left his office a week ago. Investigators learned that Michael was soon to lose his job at B&D following a quarterly meeting of directors. 2 days ago, it was discovered, much to Cynthia's horror, that her investment accounts had been emptied, transferred to several offshore accounts, and then redistributed to other locations several days ago. One interesting piece of evidence is a piece of paper in Michael's desk in his office with an account number on it. FBI forensics traced it to a bank in Costa Rica that received $1.5 million from a bank in the Cayman Islands, and which was then emptied within the last 3 days. They also found an airline ticket in the name of Michael Bishop, and a man matching his description had boarded a flight to Costa Rica a week ago. Cynthia could not explain how Michael could have accessed her accounts, and of course, she did not admit to a long affair with him, especially in my presence. For now, she could only hope that he would be found and her stolen fortune returned. Long after they left, I found her crying in her office. I have to go to Baton Rouge in the morning, Cynthia. Can you handle all this here? She nodded. Maybe 3 people can come in and help. I slept like a baby that night and loaded up a couple of suitcases in the morning. If she noticed anything else missing, Cynthia didn't say anything. The car stopped at the bottom of the driveway, and I looked up at Mrs. Mabel Masson's old place and remembered Charlie's frequent expression. She was rich in land, but empty in the purse, literally, and laughed most of the way to Baton Rouge. Looking back, I felt like a cheapskate for a while, so I opened an account for Cynthia. It wasn't enough to return to a life of luxury, but if she took that money and the fire insurance proceeds, she could make a modest living in her treasured home. I also didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to us. I was going to file for divorce, but decided to leave everything as it is. I didn't want any publicity, so I often went to Jackson to fulfill my marital duties. She was still an excellent lover. I no longer had marks on my back, and I was sure that no one else had penetrated her. One evening, while Cynthia and I were along the Pearl River, we had a serious conversation. This happened after the police and FBI left and went on with their business. Cynthia, why did Michael Bishop end up dead and naked in your bed at the lake? She didn't want to answer at first, but before she could, I intervened. I'll keep it as simple as possible. I'm guessing that you've been having an affair with that bastard for a long time. Now, before you answer me, you better think carefully. You don't know what I know, and you better believe there's enough good guys who can make a bunch of stupid Jackson girls scream the truth until their lungs burst from the effort. Do you understand what I'm talking about? If so, then tell me the whole damn truth from the beginning. Her lips started to tremble, and I thought she was going to cry, but she didn't. Instead, she started from the beginning and basically confirmed what I already knew. What I didn't know shocked me, and I drove her home in silence. When I was in Jackson, I was a loving husband, but the dynamic had changed. I was no longer Cynthia Dawes Blanchard's husband. She became Maynard Blanchard's wife, and she will not forget it as long as I allow her to remain so. I didn't know how long it would be. Michael was now considered the mastermind behind the fire, deception, and theft of Cynthia's funds, and was wanted as part of an active FBI investigation. Somehow, I doubted that it would ever surface. Mostly, Cynthia went back to her old life, but sometimes I saw that look, a look of fear somewhere deep inside. She was still beautiful, men were still chasing her, and as far as I could tell, her friends were still cheating on their husbands, but with surveillance on, not once did I see her participating in their fun. I remembered what she said when I first heard that conversation. If Michael hadn't slept with me, there wouldn't be anyone else. That's the way it is. Perhaps this was the impetus for the plan. The creaking of the wooden planks sounded depressing as the houseboat swayed in the wind as tropical rain poured down on everything. It wasn't a hurricane, but any tropical storm deserves respect in the deep wilderness. When I was a boy, Charles brought me here, deep into the Atchafalaya River basin. To make a man out of me, he said. It worked. He left me here alone for a week during my 14th summer. I had several pounds of beans and a short string of sausages, along with whatever seasonings could be found in the galley, mostly Cajun seasonings and hot sauce with pepper, salt, and thyme along with garlic and onion powder. What I also had was a wealth of food at my feet if I could keep them from being bitten. Crustaceans and catfish were in abundance for the patient man or boy. Through this experience, I learned to live independently in America's largest wetland. I was not alone in this regard. Rudy Cormier, his brother Damien, and a lanky old Creole named Pierre Monet had similar experiences. Each of them could disappear unnoticed and come and go through these swamps, never to be seen unless they wanted to. Pierre Monet sat in the corner on a small stool, listening to the incessant rain drumming on the tin roof, his white eyes framed by the darkness of his black face. Only reflections of light gave him a human form. His gaze was directed at the figure in the opposite corner, trembling under his silent gaze. Moments ago, Pierre's long, bony fingers were fingering a small ukulele, breaking the silence along with its accompanying emotional outbursts of lyrical reconciliation, forced upon the man sitting across from him in fear. Everything stopped before I entered the room. I lit another kerosene lamp, and the shadow from the chimney cast shadows on the walls around us. Rudy Cormier sat across the table from me. The figure in the corner raised its face, and yellow flashes of light brought to life the disfigured features of the once proud little peacock. The side of his face and the corners of his mouth were bruised in the dim light, and his eyes were sunken and out of focus. I can't read people's souls or their hearts, but I could see the fear masked on his face. He knew what he had been through and knew that life was worse, but it all passed, like the rain that had already fallen around us. This is not Jackson or Natchez Trace. It's not even within Western civilization. For what the clocks and calendars were worth, it might have been the Mesozoic if not for the four souls inside the floating tin hut. "So what now, Mandamaz?" Ruddy asked from the table. "When the storm passes, give him his bag along with a can of beans and sausage or something and take him across Bell River. Make sure he gets on the Cass and Chase. He won't be coming back. Now I need to talk to him alone for a while." Ruddy and Pierre both rose from their seats and walked out under the canopy on the port side. I just watched the broken man for a few minutes, seeing what he had become. Pierre Monet led one of the gangs, a society of Creoles from Haiti whose tentacles penetrated into some local communities. They generally kept to themselves and minded their own affairs, although over the years they collaborated with Munford Cormier on certain matters. When I was a boy, I remember Charles entertaining Munford and two really dark-skinned Haitian men for a long time. I never knew what they were doing, but there was a lot of smoke and secrets in the room. One of the Haitians glanced at me as I hid behind the curtain in the kitchen. His look scared me to death, and I ran to my bedroom, accompanied by the laughter of the men. With lightning flashing all around us, adding an ominous light to the already terrible scene, I studied the prisoner a little more before speaking. "Mr. Bishop, or whatever your name will be in your next life, I'm interested in a few things." He raised his eyes and looked at me, but his gaze was empty. How can a man convince another man's wife to cheat on him for 14 years and believe there will never be consequences for such an insult? I don't know whether he could answer or not, but it didn't matter. I was speaking rhetorically for now. Now one man might think it's better to leave it up to the lawyers and walk away with his head held high, albeit humiliated. Another might just put a bullet in you and urinate on your body. And there are men like me, Michael, who would rather you know that life is one constant misery, one after the other, not knowing when some unknown voodooist might add a new twist to your rather eventful life. Where are we now? But I still have questions. Do you understand me? He nodded uncertainty. "Okay, let's get started. You and Monique have 2 kids, right? Great, great. When you and Cynthia were still planning to get married, you know, before you got into this unhappy relationship, did you discuss having children?" He looked at me in fear. "Answer me." "Yes, we discussed it," was his answer, but the words were half choked, forcing their way through a mouth with several missing teeth and a missing bridge. "She wanted children. I wonder why she and I didn't have children then." At that moment, I knew that he was beginning to understand the purpose of my interrogation. "If you don't tell me the truth, I will cut the life out of you right here." "She had a miscarriage and couldn't have children after that." "How did this happen, and whose child was it, yours or mine?" I looked at him intently, and he knew that the answer would save his life or destroy it. "It was your child." "How did this happen?" "She fell." I continued to stare at him. "She fell after I hit her." "Tell the whole story." Michael Bishop began to tell the story of how Cynthia became pregnant while he was on a business trip, and in anger he hit her, causing her to fall and miscarry. He continued, explaining how he demanded that she tie her fallopian tubes, thereby depriving me of the child I wanted. At that moment, she became his property, even if technically it belonged to me. She was never going to tell me about it unless she was forced to. I wanted to kill him right there, at that moment, although I already knew everything he told me. Instead, I left everything else in the shade and poured myself 3 fingers of cognac. Michael Bishop would soon become someone else and never set foot on these shores again. I had my wife back for the first time in our marriage, but I didn't know if I wanted her back. It's a funny thing about women, marriage, and love. Sometimes love has nothing to do with it, at least among certain people in Jackson. They marry for privilege and position and don't care who they spoil. In my area, messing up is a two-way street. Michael Bishop was spoiled. They both ruined me, and now it's time to clean up after us. The storm cleared after 2 days, and Pierre Monet led a distraught Michael Bishop into the moonlight and onto a small boat that would begin his journey to a Haitian-registered truck called the Cass and Chase. He was given a small plastic bag containing his new identification and passport, as well as $300. His backpack contained 3 changes of clothes and several cans of smoked fish. 6 days later, the truck left New Orleans bound for the Dominican Republic. He and I both knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that he would never be heard from again. Rudy Cormier and I accomplished what we set out to do: restore my dignity and change the lives and destinies of several people. I was to give 30% of the profits to Rudy and his accomplices, and 20% to Pierre Monet and his people, leaving half of Cynthia's fortune for myself. What I also got was a new job. "Good morning, Mr. Blanchard." My assistant Wendy greeted me with her usual cheerful demeanor. As I walked into the newly renovated 8th-floor corner office on Laurel Street in Baton Rouge, I couldn't help but notice the sly grin on her face. Manicure and Sizemore held that quarterly meeting and named me CEO of Bishop and Dawes, and as a result, I moved the company from Jackson to Baton Rouge. True, I knew nothing about running a company, but I was an excellent engineer and could learn. Plus, with Cormier on the board of Manicure and Sizemore, I had resources I could turn to. Charles' house was completely renovated, and I moved Cynthia and her pussy parade out of Jackson. Surprisingly, she did not put up any resistance and was quite pleased with the change in situation. Now about Cynthia, she gave birth to a boy, whom I named Charles Maynard Blanchard, about a year after Michael Bishop disappeared into the mists of a world ruled by the society and its various characters such as Pierre Monet. The doctors recommended using in vitro fertilization, and it worked to our satisfaction. I decided to stay married to her, despite her long-standing infidelities, if only so that she would give me the child we promised each other. If she had made herself infertile through her infidelities, I would have abandoned her to her fate. But that didn't mean we had a marriage like before. I was very careful, but there was a reason I hired Wendy as my assistant, and it had nothing to do with typing. Did that make me a good guy? Vice versa. I became hard and callous, although I could smile, have fun, and have a great time with anyone. I could make love to my wife, knowing that she would not cheat on me again, and I could raise my son, knowing that he would become a good man from Louisiana. On the other hand, somewhere out there was a man with a new name, always wondering if a ghost from his past was waiting around the corner. 18 years after the birth of Charles M., the boards creaked quietly underfoot as the wind pushed the dock toward the moored house on the water several miles up Bayou Chene. The storm had died down hours ago, leaving only light breezes as the clouds gave way to clear weather. "I don't understand why you guys like to come here," Cynthia exclaimed. Charles M. simply smiled at his mother and said, "Mom, this is where life begins. Everything you need to experience life is right here, at your fingertips." Cynthia just shook her head and continued making the jambalaya while I took the cornbread out of the oven. Rudy Cormier sat in the corner, drinking cognac. He claims it helps with his progressive Parkinson's, but the shaking still persists and his arm remains unsteady. However, he was able to beat both his youngest son, Patrick Cormier, and his friend Monstal Monet, grandson of our long-departed friend Pierre Monet. Along with Charles M., 3 guys were going to LSU this fall. We continued with dinner, and while enjoying a bottle of cognac on the deck afterwards, I watched Cynthia. She was 55, I was 57, and although she had gained a little weight over the years, she was still as attractive as the day I first saw her. After raising our son, I forgave her, but I never forgot. I pulled her out of her Jackson community, sold the Nason house on Trace, and since we had no family in Mississippi, we had no reason to visit the place except for occasional visits along the way. Instead, I made her a Louisiana woman. She learned to cook and embrace local customs and earned an MBA from LSU. She became the mistress of Charles's old house, now mine, in Baton Rouge. My relationship with Wendy lasted until Charles M. was a baby, after which we separated. She married a lawyer and stopped working to raise her family. Several years ago, I learned through certain channels that an emigrant named Martin Baylor had died in Cayenne, French Guiana, leaving behind a local common-law wife and a small daughter. He made his living as a bartender in a small hotel where his wife worked as a cleaner. I asked Rudy to find a way to give a small fund to the widow to take care of her and the child. While cleaning up after dinner, Cynthia found a small box with an ashtray and some pictures of Ruddy and Pierre Monet. Among the items was a gold ring. It was a medium-sized men's ring with a ruby stone engraved with the words Ole Miss on the top and bottom, with the year 1987 inches and the initials MB, as well as a pair of gold cufflinks with the same initials. She stood looking at it for a few moments and looked out the window at the marshes and wetlands around us before putting it back in the box and on the shelf. As she turned back into the room, our eyes met for a moment, and I saw just a brief moment of fear deep within her. But it was only a moment. Charles M. joined us, and we stood like the family we were, deep in the Atchafalaya swamps. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.